Hi, and welcome back to Foreign Office. I'm Michael Weiss, and today I'm joined by Kateryna Lisunova. She is a Ukrainian journalist of many years standing, covered the UN, covers Congress, lives in Washington, D.C. She's also a media advisor for Razom for Ukraine, which is an organization all of you should follow, and I'll put a link up when this podcast drops. Kateryna, great to see you and to talk to you. I kind of have a show where I invite my friends and colleagues who I talk to on a regular basis privately to talk publicly because I think it would be of interest, to my listeners and viewers. So it's great to have you on. I can't think of a better person to kind of give us an overview of where this so-called peace negotiation, really between the United States, Europe, and Ukraine, not even including the Russians as of yet, stands. There's been a lot of chatter about territorial concessions. The Americans say Ukraine should withdraw its military from the rest of Donetsk, and it can be a free economic zone. The Russians are calling it a demilitarized zone. These are two different concepts, with the possibility of Russia sending in their National Guard and police forces. I mean, the whole thing seems to me a complete muddle, and I'm just curious, what's the latest? What are you hearing from your sources? I know you're very close to the Ukrainian delegation. I mean, where is this thing going?
So yeah, first of all, hi, hello, Michael. Thank you for great coverage that you do as well on this topic. And it's very nice to talk to you more broadly because we do talk privately about it a lot. So
Hmm.
where are we standing right now? You just described a lot of noise that we're hearing actually, because as with many other negotiations, a lot of things are behind the closed doors. People not know a lot of details, and that is how like a lot of not factual information being brought to light, and it's very hard to understand what is true, where we're standing. Is Ukrainian officials are conceding to any territorial issues or territorial questions, because we're hearing about it a lot, and it's probably one of the main questions that journalists are asking. And I think what I'm going to share right now with you would be also very helpful for
Yeah.
journalists, for media to follow up and catch up. So first of all, Ukrainian delegation, they do not like the word territorial concessions because they do not negotiate on that. And
Right.
what is interestingly enough, they've been stating it publicly many times. Uh, and here, the first advice that I will give to journalists: there are a lot of people who may be related to Ukrainian or American side, and they may give some hints, some guesses, some their personal analysis, but there are barely five people or like 10 maximum who actually participating in those negotiations. And I personally witnessed one even in Ukrainian side. Some people, some officials have been giving not correct information for some journalists, because they might have been in a delegation, but they were not in a room in this negotiation. If you remember, at some point in Miami, there was only six people
Hmm.
involved there, three from American side, even actually two from American side, and three from Ukrainian side. So, and only those people were actually able to say some concrete information, what exactly they were
And
negotiating
these
on.
negotiations were kind of divided into buckets or categories, right? Economic integration or reconstruction, military dynamics, and then I guess also the future of Europe, NATO expansion, or Ukraine's possible and likely accession to the European Union, and so on and so forth. So it's like if you're part of one small team, you don't necessarily know what's happening with the other small teams, right?
100%, 100%. Very well said. Uh, and also it's very important to understand who are you talking to, if they were in a room directly talking to the people to American side, or American side directly talk to Ukrainian side, and what was in the negotiations. And also what is very important as well, those people who even were talking directly with American side, with Rivkov and Kushner, they're stating many times that the final decision would be by the president and by Ukrainian people. So even they cannot say that they even have no right to agree on it. on
Right.
anything. They cannot say to American side that they think this is great. We're okay with that. We're going on with that. We're following with this plan. They have just no right. And in my private conversations, they emphasizing on it very much because they do not like to hear a lot of articles or statements from the media that supposedly Ukrainian side agreed on something. And just today there was a lot of information from Ukrainian side, like debunking
Right.
the article from Le Monde yesterday, in which they stated that supposedly Ukrainian side agreed on so-called demilitarized zone in the Donbass.
Mhm.
And if you would privately talk to those concrete people who are participating in negotiations from Ukrainian side, they do not like if you bring up even the word of territorial concessions, because A, they have no right to agree on any such things. B, they always stating that if we even would negotiate on this, it's for either presidential level or further to Ukrainian people decide, which is referendum and very big thing. And
Mhm.
and once again, when there was released information from Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukrainian president, that if we talk about any territorial concessions, it's for referendum for Ukrainian people to decide. There were a lot of reactions that supposedly he is probing the ground for such thing, but we need to understand that if we even talking about such thing, it it's in the first place means that should be ceasefire, that should be stopping war, that should be security guarantees. And so even if we would talk about some territorial concessions, all those very difficult points would should be resolved before that,
Right.
which means a lot of things should be resolved before the point of even possibility of Ukrainians having some sort of referendum on this issue. And it's also a question if Ukrainians would even want to do that, because among Ukrainians there's a sentiment that they don't want to have anything to do with this deal. If we're talking
Mhm.
about just regular Ukrainians, they really don't like it. And I just read a very good article from Ukrainian journalist who actually joined the army as many others in Ukraine. And he said very interesting phrase, which I think we need to consider. He said that basically Zelensky himself, when he came to power, he was claiming that he's going to end the war in a few days. And he was actually blaming his predecessor that he didn't end the war. And the rhetoric was very, very similar to Donald Trump. But then the reality of Russian aggression, the reality of Russian imperialism, and the reality of Russian plans, open plans to go farther
Right.
than Ukraine to Europe, hits very, very hard. And so it looks like, from his article at least, that it might be the future of American president as well, because
Mm.
in the end of the day, any other historical figure who were trying to make a deal with Putin then being hit very hard by reality of
And
Putin's
I,
plans.
I think it's important because, so much has happened in the last 3 weeks. It feels like a year crammed into the space of less than a month. But it's important to remember this 28-point plan that was written really by Kirill Dmitriev, the head of the Russian Sovereign Wealth Fund, and then sort of laundered through Witkoff and Kushner in a series of meetings that took place in Florida several months ago, and then leaked to Axios and then the Wall Street Journal. This 28-point plan was largely a freelance project of Dmitriev. It was not certified by the Russian presidential administration or the Russian foreign ministry. And the initial reaction to it by the Russian state organs was kind of tentative, if not hostile. Peskov, Zakharova, they both said, well, we've never seen this plan. This is the first we're hearing of it from leaks in the press. And there was sort of an attempt to distance Moscow from this initiative. And now, as we know, has been reported in the series of meetings that have taken place in Geneva and now again in Florida, this 28-point plan has been whittled down to 19 or 20 points. We don't really know what's in it. We do know that some of the more pro-Russian statements or provisions have been removed, including, no NATO enlargement. There's a question about the cap on the size of the Ukrainian military. Is it 600,000? Is it 800,000? Questions about de facto or de jure recognition of occupied territories such as Crimea and parts of Donbass. We don't know where that. But it suffices to say the 28 points have been reduced to 19 it's been de-Russified, this document, because it's become more amenable to the Ukrainians, right? Um, that would make Moscow even more hostile toward this thing, right? So we're sitting here talking about what the Americans and the Ukrainians, possibly with some input from the Europeans who are very pro-Ukrainian, are doing just between and amongst one another, where the Russians have basically rejected this thing, or at least said, I think that the most positive statement or comment on the Dmitriev plan from Putin was, we can use this as the basis for future negotiations. So let's have talks about more talks, right? Which just seems like kicking the can down the street, buying for time, deferring this process. And also, it seemed opportunistically timed to, a an American policy, not pivot, but Donald Trump had seemed to be growing more impatient and exasperated with Putin. There were sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil. There was a question about tomahawks. There was a question about, this sort of neutron bomb legislation by Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, which would put 500% tariffs on countries importing Russian oil. All of these things were kind of moving in one direction, which was to say more pro-Ukraine and anti-Russia. And all of a sudden, here comes Dmitriev, and it just, you could hear the record kind of screech off the record player, right? And it looks like a Russian, information operation to basically relitigate everything that's already been relitigated and play for time so that Russia can essentially drag this process out. And Ukraine, of course, has to play along with this, because if Ukraine says we've had it enough, they're the ones that get bullied and bludgeoned by Trump. That's his instinct, to pick on the weaker party in this war, right? I mean, so like, what are we even doing? Is this going to end? Like you pointed out, you've said it very eloquently. Everybody has these grand ideas until they run smack into reality. Or as Mike Tyson used to say, everyone's got a big plan until they get punched in the mouth. Whether it's Zelensky in 2019 or Trump in 2025. Are we not just kind of going around the same merry-go-round again, and we're going to end up in the same place, which is no end to the war, the fighting continues, and people just agree to keep talking to have more talks? I mean, it's sort of an endless cycle, isn't it?
I mean, it depends on what conclusions each side will do after
Mm,
these circles of negotiations or any developments. Because in the end of the day, Zelensky came to the one conclusion that there is nothing reasonable from Russian side exists, and there is no way to stop any aggression of Russia except pushing them back.
mm,
This is the reality that he's been hit hard. This is
right,
the reality that a lot of American leaders been hit hard after trying to negotiate with Russia and do something economical concessions, etc. And then Russia used it in their favor against the United States. Every single American president had this experience, and
right.
whether we will end up with nothing or whether we will end up with more pressure on Russia depends on how much capable each leader to learn. It's all the matter of learn from the mistakes,
Hmm.
and also probably it all depends on ability to recognize a mistake as well, but that's a separate story. Also, interestingly enough, you brought up, according to Zelensky, there are 20 points at this moment in this document. He repeated it many times. Another thing which was very interesting in a conversation with a journalist, it is actually in very interesting WhatsApp chat. I will tell you this interesting story. So when he's voice overing the answers on journalist questions, Ukrainian journalists. So and when Ukrainian journalist asked the question, the way United States is forming it, which means what about the territorial concessions that United States are suggesting?
Mm,
Zelensky pushed back and said that this is Russians who are
mm,
pressuring and suggesting territorial concessions through the American side, and which is also confirming the fact that it's all of that is just the Russian plan being pushed through the American side as a mitigators, and this is what Zelensky said. And
right.
this is another thing which is I would advise for journalists to just listen carefully to public statements, because they have a lot of open and very interesting information which can clarify everything. And as we see at this point, Zelensky became the source who's more openly talking about all the suggestions and all the things that have been raised during negotiations. But it's very important for journalists to not mess up the fact when Ukrainian president just sharing what's been in the conversation, and
Mm,
what would be conceded to, like what would be agreed on.
right.
And it's a very, as I see in many articles, it's very big mistakes made by journalists when they're releasing information as if as if Ukrainian mentioned that this thing been discussed, it means that Ukraine may concede or agree on that. He just discussing and sharing with journalists what the proposals, what the ideas been floating around, and what they're talking about. And he
Mm,
became very open among all those sides in negotiations. He decided to be more open to share this information. And how did that happen? It's another very interesting story, because a lot of people think that like we all tend to search some bigger meaning in many things, and as if there is like bigger plan and bigger strategy, but some things are happening very naturally and very very just human like.
hmm
For example, this chat in a group chat of journalists that Zelensky started to share information with. All this information, all these updates we got from him through the last 3 days. And so the first 2 days, how did all of that happen? So there is a chat that's been created for Ukrainian journalists when the big scale invasion started
mm,
with the Office of President. So the communication would be much faster and shared with everybody at once, not for many to duplicate the same thing for many journalists, because as you know, they all also connected in one source information. This marathon they call it. It's another question if it's good at this point, but in the very beginning all the journalists agreed to do the live broadcast together because there are shellings and everybody under the threat. So at some point there were no connections from one TV channel, and another one could pick up the signal and broadcast what is happening. And so that is why there been created this WhatsApp chat for journalists after big scale invasion. And after some time, if in the very beginning there were shared like a lot of crucial, very important, timely information, then it was mostly like sharing some latest publication statements of Zelensky. It became more official. But just a few days ago, Ukrainian journalists just started to joke in this chat and asking President Zelensky, so where there going to be another Yermak? They were joking like, when the white smoke will be over Bankova,
right.
like we're gonna be the chosen one, like where is he, like what's up, we're gonna replace him. And they start to do a lot of jokes about it, and the press secretary of Zelensky showed it to him. He started to laugh, and he said, and president himself suggested, why wouldn't I answer your questions in this chat as a voice message?
Mm,
And so which became like this new format of conversation had been born, which actually works very well. Journalists writing down the questions in that chat, and he's voiceovering the answers for everybody at
mm,
once. It's like 10 to 15 questions, etc., and which made the communication much faster, more broad, and more open.
right.
And just yesterday, there was also another format of conversation. It's existed before. They call it, it's a conversation like one-on-one with president to the presidential office. It could be like 10 journalists and him without cameras. And they discussing more in-depth, more honest things, but there are no recordings being made.
Mm,
They are allowed to publish things after that, but you don't have a precise quote. And that is why, for example, yesterday we confronted with a lot of slightly different quoting of statements of Zelensky, because there was just like group of 10
right.
journalists who talked to him privately, and they were able to release some information, and it wasn't a quote per se. That is why we had some misunderstanding, I think, of some statements, etc. And that is why we got all of this, growing
Mm,
issues of, oh, Ukraine is ready to concede territory or something like that,
right.
which is not true. And this morning, precisely, office president in that very chat was saying like, okay, we need to do something with this. We need to do like
Yeah.
debunk. We need to
But it seems
understand.
like the need for Zelensky to talk directly to journalists on a consistent basis is precisely because, so much of the reporting about Ukraine is being written by non-Ukrainians in the West who are kind of, reading the tea leaves or talking to anonymous sources in the US administration or in Europe and trying to piece together what's taking place. And it sort of seems like a kind of information crisis center has been created to just get things directly from the Ukrainian side to Ukrainian reporters who can make sense of it. Because, again, we see yet, from time from the very beginning of, Ukraine entering into the American political consciousness, 2014 with Euromaidan, but also with the first Trump administration, his first impeachment, we always seem to be talking about Ukraine, but not hearing from Ukrainians. That's sort of the second day or third day bit of reporting. And I think it's very important to kind of get this, directly from, the country whose future, whose fortune is at stake here. Um, so can you then like, I mean, obviously there's a lot of things that are very sort of inside baseball or sort of court palace intrigue. I mean, you mentioned Mr. Yermak. So for those who don't know, this was Zelensky's yeah, chief aide, sort of the gray cardinal of his administration, very powerful figure. For a long time, the joke in Ukraine was, if a Western leader were coming to Kyiv, they would say, "Oh, I'm going to meet Zelensky." It's like, "Oh, you're going to meet Zelensky? Why are you meeting Zelensky? It's the only way I can get to Yermak, right?" Like this was kind of
Yeah,
like the bad joke.
that's a good one. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a
So
good one.
anyway, now he has resigned, or really he was fired because he's
Yeah.
deeply implicated in this corruption scandal involving Ukraine's
Mhm.
energy sector, which is the one place you probably don't want to steal money from, given that so many people go without power and electricity and heat in the
I
winter.
mean, there should be no place
There
that
should
you
be
want to
no place, right?
say.
But this is like the worst place
Yeah, yeah,
to
yeah.
take money from. So Yermak is gone.
Mhm.
And this seemed to have removed. I mean, one of the things I wanted to ask you about because the
Mhm.
Washington Post just had a story I'll come to in a second. But from my perspective, seeing Donald Trump, seeing especially Steve Witkoff, who, shall we say, is very, very impressionable when it comes to the Russian position and seems to be taking Russian talking points unfiltered and sort of adulterated and passing them off as the American position. Um, because of this corruption scandal, coming as it did at a time when the Russians have been making slow but steady advances in the east around the Pokrovsk direction, that, the cynics in the administration, of which there are many, were using this as an opportunity to really batter Ukraine, put a lot of pressure on Zelensky. You are at the weakest you've been politically since the full-scale invasion,
Mhm.
February 2022. Your chief advisor is now up to his eyeballs in theft of state funds. Now is the time for us to impose something on you, to tell you what you're going to accept, whether it's territorial concessions or a cap on your military, elections, which, this has been kind of the recurring thing. Obviously, Putin does not recognize Zelensky as any political leader whatsoever. He's illegitimate, but Donald Trump increasingly seems to be of the opinion that Zelensky is also illegitimate. He keeps banging on about why haven't there been elections in Ukraine, even though constitutionally you can't in the state of martial law. But anyway, Zelensky comes out now and says, okay, let's consider elections in 60 to 90 days. But the only way we can do it, like logistically hold an election, is with security guarantees to ensure that the fighting is stopped and that people can, go to the polls and actually cast a ballot. So it seems like Zelensky's calling Trump's bluff on this, saying, "You want elections? Okay, you have to give me something before I can give you that." But, what is going on at the political level inside the presidential administration in terms of, okay, Yermak has been pushed to one side.
Mhm.
You mentioned, sort of this like the anointment of the new pope. Who is going to be the new Yermak? Is it going to be,
Yeah.
Budanov, the head of military intelligence? Who are the other comers? Our friend, the former ambassador,
Fedorov,
Fedorov,
Kislitsa,
Kislitsa.
yeah,
Yeah.
those are basically the main right now suggestions.
Right. And all of them are seen as an improvement on Yermak, at least from the Western imagination. But, there's a question of if it's a guy like Budanov, then clearly we have someone with a military background and an intelligence background. This seems to elevate the security portfolio above, say, the economic
Mhm.
portfolio or just the pure kind of diplomatic political portfolio. What is your read of like this sort of internal kind of skullduggery taking place inside the Ukrainian presidential administration?
By Zelensky's words himself, like in literally voiceovering this message in a chat, and he repeated it a few times. He said, at first it looked like he might appoint someone very fast, and there was a possibility that he will do that. But then he started had more have more conversations, and he ended up even with saying like maybe there will be no next year mark, no such a position of like a head of office. Maybe there will be head of office president because this is a real position, but he will not play that role that Yermak played at some point because it's
Right.
actually kind of being created artificially. by Yermak himself. And he said, maybe I would not, don't even need this position at this point. He was referring to few things. Hard to work on, difficult to work on it right now when the negotiations are happening, all of this happening, and it feels like not that important thing to resolve at this point. It's
Hmm.
the first thing. Secondly, he was stating that he just doesn't have enough people to place on that position. And this, when we can come to the conclusion of a little bit of a personal crisis of Zelensky with the people that he is appointing, because you already see that his former prime minister is minister of defense right now, Shmyhal, like he literally moving the same pieces just to different positions, which I personally don't think is the best decision to make. I think uh, personally that there should be open competition to any positions. There should be open um, search for a position, because from Zelensky words, there are not enough people who actually want to take this position, who actually want to take this thing. It's not that easy to replace some people. Like, for example, when he was talking to Kasica, he's saying he's playing a crucial role right now in this negotiations. Now, to put him also responsible for every other thing would be very difficult to just pull him out of there. That is
Hmm.
why Fedorov is one of the most possible candidates, because it's much easier to replace his position.
Right.
He's basically responsible for how you call it, the Ministry of Technical Developments in Ukraine. So like there are a lot of tech people who can just replace him from his own team of Fedorov. And so that is why he's saying it's much easier to pull him out of there and replace his position than anyone else, like Budanov, for example, as well, holding on himself a lot. And that is why we can see a little bit, as on my personal opinion, crisis of Zelensky was people. He's saying that there are not enough people who want to go there. That's not easy to replace some positions, but I think there should be just more open competitions, more open suggestions for people to apply for this position, because I do think that in Ukraine there are a lot of people who would have do something like that, but once again, also like this kind of position is very close to him. He probably just doesn't want to see someone just outside of other world. But in the same time, this is how you hire people.
Right.
You you make an open competition, you do all the background checkings and all of it, and then you hire a person.
Right.
This is what should be done, I think, at some point.
But
We
removing Yermak, I mean, Yermak was the word that media in the West likes to use when they're being euphemistic like this is he's a polarizing figure. Well, I would say he was kind of a scandalized figure and, disliked by a great many Ukrainians, right?
Mhm.
Removing him from the chessboard has at least given the Europeans more leverage with the Americans because they can go to Zelensky and say, okay, so you've done, the hard part of getting rid of the guy who is seen to be corrupt, implicated in this scandal. You obviously have to continue with the investigation and allow full transparency of your anti-corruption bodies, to carry forth. But this is a good start. We can go back to the Americans and say, now this cudgel you've been wielding with the Ukrainians has been taken out of your hand. However, there's other problems. Like I alluded to this Washington Post story, which just broke today. Rustem Umerov, the former defense minister and now the secretary of the Ukrainian National Security and Defense Council,
Mhm.
also one of the lead negotiators in the delegation with the Americans, was also in Florida talking to Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner before the Dmitriev document leaked. He has been rumored to be implicated as well in this corruption scandal. And apparently, according to the Washington Post, and the New York Post broke this story before, but the Washington Post has more details. He had met with both the director and the deputy director of the FBI, Kash Patel and uh, Bongingo, or whatever is his name.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Mhm.
I still
Yeah.
have a hard time fathoming that this podcast conspiracy theorist is deputy director of the FBI. But it's very unusual for the two top officials of America's federal law enforcement counterintelligence agency to meet with a member of a Ukrainian delegation. And the rumor or the hypothesis that is being advanced, not least by the Europeans, is that Umerov might be involved with the FBI to get amnesty for himself in exchange for basically playing ball with the Witkoff show. So, in other words, weaken the Ukrainian negotiating position or make rationalizations for why it should be weakened and, get a get out of jail free card. Now, again, this is speculative. perhaps a little too conspiratorial, but it's something that people are talking about, and now it's in the Washington Post. This seems to be another potential liability for not only Zelensky, but for Ukraine to have a key member of the delegation who has this sort of, is working under this cloud of suspicion. I mean, what in to your mind, and I know, you're a reporter, I'm not asking you to, get too
Mhm.
deeply into your own personal opinions here, but optically, how does this look from the Ukrainian side? Are they sending their best people at this kind of critical juncture to play
Mhm.
hardball with the Americans, who are very clearly playing hardball with them? Or could there
Mhm.
be a better team in place to be negotiating?
Let's start with the facts that
Yeah.
I know. First fact:
Mhm.
if he would agree to play ball with Vitkov in exchange of him being kind of pardoning, not pardon, but like being saved by FBI, it's some kind of important witness, and was saved in the United States, for example. Now, if he would, let's do the theoretical thing. If he would agree to do something like that, it doesn't seem to matter actually because he's not the one who's making decisions.
Right.
If they would get some yes or some agreement, some blessings from Umerov, that would sound ridiculous for Ukrainians. They would be like, Ukrainians, just regular people, just like Ukrainian on the street. Ukrainian grandma would be like, Umerov agreed to consider with territories. Who Umerov is
Right.
to consider with my territories. That's basically the sentiment narrative and all of it. And it's not only I'm not only talking on just the basic positions, basic like questions of constitution, basic fact that he's not the highest person in Ukrainian government. We're talking just on the basic sentiment, and that was also one of the questions that people have been raising when Romero end up in Miami at some point. In any case, people were saying like, what he even doing there? He's not responsible for such negotiations or like concessions to make or anything. Then he became responsible. Then Zelensky appointed him as a part of the negotiation group. But at the same time, he doesn't have powers to concede to anything. So like whatever they whatever the if the theory is if this like rumors are right, whatever they could have get from him is to just bring this document to Zelensky, which he eventually did. And but agree on anything, do some concessions or anything like that. That's just not in his powers.
Hmm.
He also doesn't have much support among Ukrainians because there are conversations that he might be the second one brought in this Nabu investigation, that he might be the second figure to be investigated, etc. And people are thinking like, if it's true, he should be removed as well. That's basically what would be the next step expected from Ukrainian society. And as we see so far, which is we can compliment here on President Zelensky, he's playing well with Ukrainian society. When
Yeah.
Ukrainian society says they don't want something or they want to even those protests that been
Yep.
this summer, yeah, or when people were demanding to fire Yermak, he's following those things, which actually gives him more support from Ukrainian society. It is much easier to go with any negotiations when you have Ukrainian people behind him. And firing Yermak was actually
That was a huge deal for Zelensky. I mean,
releasing pressure from him
right.
very much from
Because
Ukrainian
I mean,
society.
Yermak was his lawyer for many years. I mean, they were fused at the hip. Nobody thought one could exist without the other. So it was, I mean, getting rid of his closest confidant. So yeah. And again, Ukrainian civil society always shows up when they're pissed off, they let you know it. And they
Yeah,
don't care who's in charge. They're just going to, even in the midst of wartime, they're going to line the streets of Krashatik and protest, which is one of the sort of great democratic virtues of Ukraine versus its aggressive next door neighbor. I mean, it's that popular will usually triumphs because popular will is indefatigable in that country.
yeah.
Yeah.
And another thing, if we're talking about the facts, another thing that might be somehow connected to FBI and this investigation of Nabu,
Mm.
and it's public information. Ukrainska Pravda was publishing it. When Nabu been doing this this investigation, I have negotiations in my head. When Nabu was doing this investigation, there was another figure, like another person in this investigation. He's from Odessa, businessman, also corrupt. He then left Ukraine, ended up in Florida, and Ukrainian Nabu who actually asked FBI to extradite him, to bring him back to Ukraine. FBI arrested him, but then when they start talking to him, he became valuable source of information, and they said that they
Mhm.
will not give him to Ukrainians because they want him for themselves.
Right.
This is basically what we know at this point. It's a public information. There is a name of his, like I can provide. I just can't remember it, like in the back of
But
my
to
mind.
this point, right? I mean, one of the things that's hard for Americans to get their head around is we're treating our own government now in much the same way Ukrainians have treated their government or the Russians treat their government, which is separation of powers, checks and balances, transparency, rule of law. These things are very negotiable now. Like we see the executive branch as sort of monolithic in that Donald Trump will instruct his FBI, I mean, which is led by people who have no business leading the FBI. They were loyalists installed to use whatever information can be gleaned from this corrupt businessman from Odessa who's living in Florida. And if he's providing compromat on people from the Ukrainian side in this delegation, use that again as leverage to force the Ukrainians to do that which they don't want to do. Now, as you pointed out, the delegation acts as negotiators, but also emissaries of information, and that information eventually reaches all of Ukraine. And if Ukraine says no, thank you, their will be heard, right, on the street
Yeah,
and elsewhere. I mean, in the barracks at the front line. But still, this is the kind of game that Donald Trump likes to play. He's a shakedown artist, right? He wants to play to put pressure and to exploit any vulnerabilities or weaknesses as he so sees them.
it
Uh,
just as a journalist, I need to be fair and objective. I do not know if it was if Trump was at some point
totally.
involved in this decision of FBI to not extradite this Ukrainian businessman who was corrupt,
Right.
and what exactly information he gave to them. Was it about
Mhm.
Ukrainians, or maybe was it about Russians, or maybe was it about involvement of Americans in something? Like I have no idea why exactly. It's not a public information why exactly FBI decided to not extradite him, but that's the case. And it's another thing actually which I would love to emphasize as well, because we I think in the world are we love to create this thing like idea of some kind of a source of bigger power, as if like
Mhm.
for example United States is ruling everything, everybody like agreeing or not agreeing. The extradition of this guy and pointing on this guy existence in Florida was made by Ukrainian investigative source, by NABU,
Right.
but in its investigative body. So it came from Ukraine, not it wasn't like FBI investigating some
No, no,
Ukrainians.
totally.
Yeah,
But
that's
again,
another
this is
important thing. Yeah,
this is unfortunately where the American mind has to go. I mean, usually the rule is if you have a choice between conspiracy and incompetence, always bet on incompetence, because what looks like this sort of grand design is usually just a series of comedy of errors, right? But in
yeah.
this case, we have seen evidence that Donald Trump's Department of Justice does things that they otherwise would not do because it would pleases the president, right? So
Mhm.
it's not beyond the realm of plausibility that even if Nabu is responsible for locating this guy in Florida, the DOJ kind of rubbed their hands and said, what can we get out of him and how could it help the boss,
Mhm.
get his Nobel Peace Prize or something like this, right? I mean,
Yeah.
this is just unfortunately the way politics works in the United States now. Um, I mean, tell us then where things are headed as so far as we know right now. Like, what is the next meeting? What is the next communique? What is the next kind of grand summit? Or who knows? I mean, I have lost track of this and I study this almost as closely as you do. So
Yeah.
please enlighten us, Katerina, because I have no idea.
Yeah, I love this question. I really love that you said that you lost the track of it, because yesterday I did the same. I was like, oh my God, it sounds like so much noise. I will think about it in the morning. And then I like pull out the sources and clarified everything and released some information on my Twitter, which
Mm,
actually anyone who follows us right now should follow as well, with all the details, what exactly happening right now, because yesterday was a lot of noise and we can keep on see the, if there's like little piece of information being released, there are a lot of mystifications being built on it, like and ideas or guesses or something like that. So what we know for sure, coming back to how Ukrainian side is negotiating, right? Once again, they do not like the word of territorial concessions because they're not talking about it. Also, they keep on emphasizing that if the conversations is going around territory, they're talking only about contact line. Contact line, it's a territory where the active fighting is happening, where the war is happening. It's basically updating on the situation on the war zone, and also explaining why explaining why Ukraine is actually not losing this war, because this is another very big propaganda being brought from Russian side. And today we saw a very good example of debunking this propaganda, because we've seen Kupiansk, how Putin stated just, when was it, like a few weeks ago, 12 I think on 20th, I think November 20th. On November 20th, Putin stated that supposedly Kupiansk, it's already been taken, which is in the Kharkiv region. Kharkiv, it's previously was the capital of Ukraine, very important city, and actually the Kharkiv region is very close to Russian border as well, which is very important to understand the map what we're talking about. And he said that supposedly this key city already been taken by Russians, and he even publicly invited journalists to cover it. And all of that. And today we've seen Zelensky came to cover it, but from his personal Ukrainian point of view of saying no one of Russians here. We pushed them. There was attempts to push them back much farther. Kupiansk is not occupied, and similar situation we have with Pokrovsk. Despite the fact that situation is very difficult, but here's the thing: when people are saying that situation on the front line is very difficult, it is difficult. It's a very tough and difficult war. We cannot describe it any other ways, but it doesn't mean that Ukrainians are losing, falling apart. Ukraine is, falling apart and all of that. And when you ask me what is next, we already seen from Zelensky that the next thing, and he stated it by himself, it's to prove those points that Ukraine is not losing. Ukraine is not actually weak part in this negotiations in this war, etc. Because we've heard a lot from American side that supposedly Russia will take those territories eventually, sooner or later. You better make a deal right now to have like less blood and less killings and all of that. But we do know as well that the Donbass that Russians are trying to take, they're trying to take it from 2014. It's the most fortified zone, and it's almost like breaking down the wall that protects all the Europe from Russian aggression. And obviously Russians want that, and they want it more than anything else. That is why the conversation around this is so much pressured on Ukraine. But they did not do it for the last 10 years. And when we hearing the statement that eventually they would do it, what is eventually? Like in 100 years, in 1,000 years? Like, that's very interesting. That's very.
I mean, why give them a gift that they have expended so much blood and treasure trying to, not have as a gift, but as a piece of conquest or conquered
and failed.
And
failed. That's another thing. So the next thing, we will definitely see more information from Ukrainian side of a situation, a battlefield, and explaining those things that we're talking right now. That's another thing. Definitely, though, there are going to be those meetings in Europe this weekend, the one that's been announced. We don't know if United States will participate in it. We heard it from Donald Trump that he doesn't know that if they would be there. But Ukrainians, Europeans should be there. They're planning to be there, and there should be more negotiations regarding different pieces of the so-called peace plan. And we're talking precisely right now about economical side of it. And there is information that something on economic side of renewal of Ukraine, etc., could be agreed in the nearest future, because it's something which has the least confrontation questions about. So we should expect that thing might be confirmed. There might be, but it's in a longer distance future, some security guarantees agreed for Ukraine. But also, even if those would be agreed, it's a very big question how it would be implemented, and if ceasefire and the end of the war will follow after that. But those two parts of the remember we talked about that this peace agreement and or whatever we call it have been right now separated on few separate topics, and one of those is economical. Zelensky himself says that there are three key separations in it. He said he calls it economical part, part of security guarantees, and he call it the part which will make the end of war possible.
Hmm.
He called it like that. He called it something which would draw the map of possibility to end this war.
Hmm.
He doesn't call it territorial concessions.
Right.
Once again, it's a very important thing that Ukrainians, they do not like when this kind of word even brought up. And once again, when we hear that there is pressure on Ukrainians to do territorial concessions, it doesn't mean that Ukrainians are taking that pressure.
Right.
That's something that we need to remember.
I have one more question. I'm very curious to hear your answer to it. So, one of the things I tried to understand or reconcile. I think it's fair to say Donald Trump's instincts are, I want to deal with the Russians. I want to be friends with Putin. I want to end the war. Let's make Russia great again, and Russia could be a great ally or partner or whatever with the United States. I mean, I consider this just fantastical thinking and also dangerous thinking. However, it is also the case that certain decisions have been taken at the policy level by this administration, which cannot be spun as objectively pro-Russian. For instance, The Atlantic just reported that Ukraine's campaign to basically take out the Russian shadow fleet of oil tankers in international waters, I mean, close to Turkey, whatever, that this campaign has not been met with hostility by the US government. And we recall, like under the Biden administration, any attacks by Ukraine using, again, homegrown munitions to hit energy infrastructure in Russia, that was that got Jake Sullivan all at Twitter because he was worried that this was going to affect the price of gas at the pump and all this. So the Biden administration basically said no until the very end, and they kind of allowed it. But Trump has been much more lenient. In fact, not just lenient, but in some cases complicit with Ukraine's attacks on Russian oil and gas. It's this weird kind of, duality of thinking. He wants Russia to be America's friend, but not at the expense of America being top dog and not at the expense of Russia kind of having to pay a price for that friendship. In other words, he likes to see the Russian economy sort of bled white. And he's encouraging of these I mean, the U.S. has shared intelligence with Ukraine for deep strikes inside Russian territory, targeting, oil depots and terminals and so on. It's this weird sort of paradoxical thinking. How do Ukrainians sort of make sense of this? I mean, I think, by now most Ukrainians feel like this man he's looking desperately to sell our country out, or at least wrap this thing up, no matter the price that we as Ukrainians have to pay. And yet, at the military intelligence level, interesting things are happening, and maybe Donald Trump is not privy to all of them because I don't think he's even read the 28-page peace plan that Steve Witkoff claimed was his own, much less has he read the 19-point plan that has been negotiated with the Ukrainians. So he's not a details guy, he's big picture. But, he is the man in charge. So he's allowing, people like Grinkevich, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, who's also the commander of European forces, to push the button or allow Ukraine to push the button on certain attacks inside Russia. How does this come about? What do you guys make of this?
That's a very good, another good question. So we need to separate here, like put in different buckets, Ukrainians. So
Yeah.
I will tell you from Ukrainian society perspective, from Ukrainian government perspective, and from
Hmm.
journalist perspective, from my own perspective as
The
an
very
analytic.
careful distinction you're making. I like that.
Yeah. So Ukrainians, just a regular society, I mean, objectively, they feel betrayed by United States. They feel betrayed by United States. They felt very much offended after the first meeting in the White House. The sentiment, the support of Zelensky at that point jumped, increased like higher than ever.
Hmm.
Like he could have pulled like 3 elections at that point. But the point is, Ukrainians. I think we can talk more about. I think Timothy Snyder also knows a lot about it, about generational trauma, about lack of justice, and the feeling of justice. It's
Mm.
been very much ingrained, almost in DNA of Ukrainians who've been always under suppression, or either USSR or Tsar. So this feeling of either suppression or injustice, it's very sensitive. It's like a trauma, generational trauma. It's very easy to trigger Ukrainians on that.
Yeah.
And so they are very much offended by that. And they very much offended and they feel very much betrayed. This is the sentiment of society. And that's being very honest.
Hmm.
The Ukrainian government. they do know that Donald Trump wants to end this war. They do know that Donald Trump doesn't want to play along all the way with Russian ideas because it's going to be Russian dominating on the United States. They doesn't want it either because it's America first policy, and this is what Trump actually believes. And they do know that Trump wants to end this, but he is very much business person, and he follows all this art of the deal uh, thing vision. And Ukrainians are understanding that if there is an art of the deal, there's also always involved Ukrainian interest and American interest, and that those are can cross. That could be those could be aligned. And this is where we see this support of targeting some Russian objects, these oil tankers,
Yeah.
etc., etc. This is the point where the interests, business interests, are crossing. That when they could be aligned, and this is what Ukrainian government is happily, willingly ready to participate in, because those are moments where the interests are crossing. And what the Ukrainian government is trying to show as well, that there are much more interests crossing between Ukrainian and American interests than between Russian and American. And this is what Ukrainian government is trying to show.
Yeah.
As a journalist, it's so also the person who doing like all the analysis, etc. I do know we see it, and it's something been more publicly shown by Trump. He doesn't like any losing side. He loves to support anyone who has more power, who is winning, etc. And because of the size of Russia, it's much easier to convince anyone that they would win and they're the powerful side. And it's a very tough negotiation point for Ukrainians to prove otherwise, because it is not true. Russia is not that enormously powerful. It's dangerous because we have literally psychopath ruling the huge country with nuclear powers. This is true. It's dangerous. But is it this almighty and unbeatable, undefeatable? This is not true.
Right.
Because honestly, historically, there were no empire which was not unbeatable, you
Hmm.
know. And I think time works here on Ukrainian side very much, very well. That is why we can give this great example of the fact that Russians were not able to conquer Donbass for more than 10 years now, and that Ukraine is democracy and changing presidents, and also the fact that in the end of the day, Putin is much older and he will not like by the. I always love to calm myself down with the thought that if anything in the world happens, I do know that I will witness Putin's death just because of my age and his age. And this is what comes me down to, and that is why I just with this very simple examples, the time works much better for Ukrainians to prove that they are not the uh, small country and losing side in this war, and they have more powers than Russia trying to describe. And those powers can be shared with American side, with American people, and this is where the interests are crossing. So this is how it's perceived by government, by me as a journalist, and by Ukrainian society.
Mm. And also, I mean, you have the most combat experience fighting an adversary that NATO was basically put together to fight, and you're doing it single-handedly. And now NATO is coming to Ukraine to say, teach us about drones, teach us about military innovation and all these things. I mean, that Dan Driscoll, the Secretary of the Army, was not meant to go to Kyiv to deliver an ultimatum for peace.
Yeah.
He was there to ask about military cooperation and procuring drones from Ukraine's own homegrown arsenal. I mean, so, the fact remains there's a lot more to be gained, a lot more of a return on investment partnering with Ukraine than there ever will be partnering with Russia. But Russia has made ample use of this kind of information propaganda campaign that, they're just this sort of untapped El Dorado of riches that Americans can profit from. I'm no doubt Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, and the cronies that they surround themselves with will make money with Russians. But that's not going to help the American taxpayer. It's not going to help the American economy, right?
Yeah, and Americans in general, and the country as it is. And honestly, I know I'm pretty much biased as well, but honestly, betting on Russia right now, it's betting on a side which will lose eventually because they like just look at the system of dictatorship that they have, economy and all of it. Like it's a betting on a side that would eventually lose, with or without Ukraine.
Mm.
But that's a separate thing. And also, you mentioned something interesting that I wanted to, but I already forgot. There was like some thought about the Russian propaganda, but I lost my track of thought. I'm sorry.
Well, that's a whole I
Yeah,
mean, we could do a
yeah,
whole other episode devoted to that.
yeah.
And so maybe that'll be the reason to have you back on then. Well, okay, Katerina, thank you so much for joining us. I know you're very busy, and it was a trick to get the schedule in place for you to do this, but really appreciate it. I'm sure everybody listening did as well. And please come back.
Thank you so much. Nice. Thank you for having me. Very great conversation. I love to talk to a person who very much into the topic because
Hmm.
the conversation is more interesting because you're catching up on many interesting angles that we can cover.
Yeah, I
So
don't know as much as you, but I know enough to get by to ask provocative questions. So, but on that note, you've been listening to Foreign Office. I'm Michael Weiss. My guest today is Kateryna Lisunova. She's a Ukrainian journalist, media advisor for Rezom for Ukraine, and we will see you next time. Thanks for joining.